Hello, my most amazing and awesome artists. Today we're going to be going back to our rainbow fish that you drew so amazingly last week. We are going to be using oil pastels and Zentangle worksheets. You have looked at Zentangles before. That just means any pattern that repeats again and again. That pattern could be a line, it could be a shape, it could be anything, even like a dot. Anything that repeats. We're using neon oil pastels. These oil pastels are new and super special, so please make sure to take care of them. You can take care of them by using them the right way, which would mean that you're using them kind of like a crayon, but they work like paint, so make sure that you are very careful not to smear them while you're coloring. You could smear them with your hand on accident, so just keep in mind that art wipes are always there. Also make sure that they don't roll off the table, because if they fall on the floor and somebody steps on them, that oil pastel is gone forever. Now I'm using my oil pastel to fill in my scales on my fish. I have that Zentangle pattern worksheet right next to me so I can look at it to reference every once in a while that I get stuck. I'm going to put a different pattern in every scale on my fish. Notice I'm also using a variety of colors. I'm making sure that I change my color every single scale. And I just put one pattern in that scale, whether that's stripes, whether that's a square or a swirl, whatever pattern you want. Now your scales might be smaller. If your scales are teeny tiny, then what you can do is create a pattern of coloring instead, or maybe just have a couple lines or stripes inside those scales. Because if yours are teeny tiny, it'll be a lot more difficult to fit in that Zentangle pattern. If you do have big scales like I do, you could practice a different pattern in every scale to make a really awesome rainbow fish. Now, I am also leaving some white space behind my oil pastel patterns. The reason I'm leaving so much white space is because we are going to be going over top of these with neon paint. If you would like to paint today, you need to make sure to leave enough room for that paint. If you color everything in with your oil pastel is made out of oil and wax. And oil and wax says to the paint, "Get off me, paint." So if you color your whole thing in with oil pastel, it's going to push that paint right off and say, "Get off me." So please make sure that if you want to paint today, you use a little bit of oil pastel, maybe just in certain areas, like I used it on my seaweed, I used it on my scales, and then I'm going to paint the rest of my fish. Now you'll notice that as I finish up my scales, I use my oil pastels to color in a few areas that I don't want the paint to get into. The nice part about oil pastel and paint is that it does say "get off me, paint," meaning that if I don't want paint there, it won't go there if I put oil pastel there. So say I want some stripes to show up on my fish. I'm going to go ahead and do that first with oil pastel. The important part is that you do the oil pastel before the paint. If you paint and then try to color over top of it with oil pastel, it doesn't do the same magic. It will actually maybe rip a hole in your paper. So make sure that you do some lines, designs, patterns, a little bit of coloring in areas you might not want paint, like the lips, or maybe I want to do the bubbles. That way I can just paint over it easily with one color. So I'm painting or coloring in things like my bubbles, my seaweed, because I know that I'm going to go over my background with blue paint for the ocean. Instead of having to paint around all those things, the nice part is I'll be able to breeze right over and glide with my paintbrush over top. Today, you will be using a big kid paintbrush for watercolors. That means that you need to hold it the right way. Using my paintbrush, I always dip in the water. If it starts to drip, wipe it on the lip. But never tap, tap, tapping. Then I swirl around in the paint and I get that nice bright color and glide it across my paper. Always keeping my paintbrush like a ballerina on its tippy toes. Never ever going to the booty scooting ballet. Cause nobody wants to go see a ballerina at a ballet scooting around on her behind. So make sure you keep your paintbrush up on its tippy toes, dancing like a ballerina. I'm making sure that in between every color that I use of my tempera cakes, yes, those are called tempera cakes you're using today. They're like a cake shape of paint. I'm making sure that I wash my paintbrush in between changing colors. I wash it really good and use dirty old SpongeBob kind of as a towel if I need to dab it off a little bit. So I dab, dab, dab on Mr. Dirty Old SpongeBob whenever I need to wash my brush a little bit more. But these paints do require water to work. You're gonna have to wake them up because you're the first ones to use them. So I'm fast forwarding my video, but really I'm swirling swirling around in the water, and then swirling, dancing around in that paint to wake it up. You might have to say, "Wake up, paint," quite a few times before it really starts to wake up. But you don't really need to dig your paintbrush in that paint. It's not the kind of paint that is already wet. It's the kind that just needs a little bit of water dancing on top of it and swirling around to get it on the tippy toes of the paintbrush. After I paint my fish, whatever colors I want, then I'm going to move on to my background. Notice the magic that happens. That neon oil pastel shows right through the paint because the oil pastel is saying to the paint, "Get off me, paint." So whatever I paint, it's going to go ahead and show up nice and bright as long as I'm swirling around quite a few times as I'm painting. If I were to only swirl once or twice, my color would not be as bright. The longer you dance around in that paint, the brighter your color will be. We might even get some special lights out to look at our neon fish today. These are going to be awesome. I cannot wait to see what you create. All right, artists, make sure that when you're finished that you put your painting on the drying rack. Remember, these paintings are going to be very wet. You don't want to get too much water on them because then they could rip. But if you think that your painting is ready to go and you've got all the spots covered and it's your best work, then I'm going to clean up my hands with an art wipe, pick it up with 2 hands like the most important pizza I've ever delivered, flat, of course. Then it should be on the drying rack, ready to go into our art show. All right, artists, have an awesome time and make sure you clean up your area when you're done painting. I can't wait to see what you create.